things that are dragging along for the ride as far as performance issues or risks. And I could see it being very easy for people in the legal community to just keep that at arm's length and just the conveyor belt kind of process you just talked about, not give adequate scrutiny as we're engaged in engineering and designing new capability.
This is the AI Leadership Podcast by AI Leaders. Practical, to-the-point content helping you drive results with AI. Here's Chris and Frank.
Hi, welcome to the AI Leadership Podcast. I'm Frank Strickland.
I'm Chris Whitlock.
We have a very special guest today who will introduce himself in just a moment, but Rob is both an attorney and a friend of ours. And it is noteworthy that in the first for this podcast, in terms of having a guest, we are going to address the issue of ethics and the law and AI. Rob, as we get started, we're going to drill more into your background as we go through probably what's going to be a couple of episodes, and we'll also put the links to your firm in the show notes. But give everybody the elevator introduction of Rob Bracknell.
I will, but first I want to say I've definitely got microphone envy. Look at those things, and I'm just talking out into the air here. I seriously got microphone envy. You guys are.
They are issued on retirement, Rob. So yeah, when
I'm retired once, man. What? Hey guys, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it too. This episode of Three Bald Guys talking about stuff. Hey, I'm Rob Bracknell, everyone. I am an attorney with the law firm of Crenshaw, Ware & Martin. It's a general business law firm in Norfolk, Virginia. We do a bunch of stuff that you would think you would do in a port town, work particularly around maritime because there's water everywhere here in Hampton Roads. The firm does a lot of things, but lately my focus has been on some maritime issues, which I kind of love. When you can combine, your vocation with the things you're doing is getting ships underway. That's kind of a cool thing, right?
That's awesome.
Window of the firm, I can look west and east and see ships being repaired out in the BAE System shipyard and Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And I look up river towards the west and you can see ships moored everywhere. It's a reminder of how important shipping is to America's commerce and the movement of goods around the world. Norfolk is the third largest port on the East Coast. And, when the bridge fell up in Baltimore a couple months ago, Norfolk absorbed a ton. I don't know what the percentages are, but a ton of their overflow cargo. And it was nice to have that luxury of a deep water port that was just, to the south there. Ships could just come in and divert.
Mahan would approve your choice of domicile.
I have coffee coming in. Can I have it, please? Thank you. My wife is handing me coffee through the door, so that's nice. You guys are drinking, so I had to have a cup.
That's fantastic.
Gotta have it.
Rob, this discussion of ports is going to feature prominently in the first episode.
It is, in fact. I brought that up on purpose, right?
Yeah. Before we get to that case, just at a high level, Rob, philosophically and legally, how do you think as an attorney about ethics and the law? Yeah,
and international security context in particular, I think is important. Although I think we rely on this across every endeavor to have a baseline of ethical conduct, and we achieve it sometimes in the breach, but as long as you have baselines and norms, you know where you are. And if my interest in national security is for 8 years before I came to the law firm, I was a civilian attorney with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And for 22 years before that, I was in the U.S. Marine Corps, 15 years as a lawyer and 8 years as an armor officer, 7 years as an armor officer. So that's sort of my background that sort of brings me to the national security sphere and my thoughts about how important ethics is. My theory, it's not a theory, my contention has always been that ethics that law is ethics regularized by procedure, right? Every law, every statute that's in the book, whether it's a criminal statute or really whether it's a commercial statute, if it's a civil statute, reflects some ethical norm about the way people should behave. Or it lays down procedures which allow us to vindicate certain ethical procedures. So, for example, murder. Murder by itself isn't good or bad. It's bad because we've chosen to believe that it's bad. It is conceivable there could be a philosophical system out there that doesn't see it that way. I don't know. It would be pretty alien to the human experience because most of us can agree that murder is malum in se. It's bad in itself. But there's other criminal statutes out there that we've chosen to criminalize that reasonable minds can differ, and they reflect our sense of what's ethical in society. For example, Hunter Biden was convicted this week of being an addict in possession. It's 18 U.S.C. It's a subsection of 18 U.S.C. Section 922. There's a bunch of different prohibitions on being able to own a gun. Is one of them is the one you always hear about is felon in possession. Once you're a felon, you can no longer own a handgun, and felon in possession gets prosecuted a ton. Addict in possession gets prosecuted a lot less because it's almost like you're prosecuting a status. Being addicted, we've decided ethically, we've made the choice that being an addict is a psychological problem more than it is anything. So when you prosecute addict in possession, you're kind of prosecuting the status of being an addict. And we've kind of made an ethical choice that we don't do that very much. And while the statute is on the books, you see that in very, very low prosecution rates by the U.S. DOJ because they exercise responsible prosecutorial discretion. The other issue with Hunter Biden is that he's made some false statements on his ATF application. You just don't see that very often. And I don't know if that is going to survive appellate review. There's already some appellate case law out there that says that makes that very argument that you shouldn't be. But first of all, they never really said that. It's never been established that Hunter was an addict in possession, rather that he was a user in possession. Okay, how close in time to the possession do you use? If I smoke, let's say I went to go buy a gun. If I smoked weed the morning that I went to go buy the gun, am I a user for the purposes of that statute? Probably. The day before? Maybe. How about 2 weeks before? If I smoked one joint 2 weeks before, and then one joint 2 weeks after, am I a user for the purposes of applying that statute?
It is a challenge in applying the law.
That's right.
Isn't it? Those kinds of issues, especially with a poorly written law.
Right. And in that they're trying to that criminalizes something that's really, really hard to draw lines around. And it goes to the ethical issue of, is it responsible to prosecute a status like user or addict and something like that? Felon in possession is kind of easy. You prove it up, you committed a felony, you are a felon. That's also a status, but it's a status that for some reason, ethically, we're more comfortable with that, right? But so that's an example. It's not a great example, but it's an example. There are statutes. Here's an example. We have made an ethical choice that we believe domestic violence is worse than regular assault because of the vulnerability of victims, right? That is an ethical choice. You get enhancements for domestic violence that are not. If Chris and I go get in a fight, first of all, I'm going to lose badly. But second of all, it's going to be treated as
combat. It would be mutual combat.
Right. It might not even get prosecuted. It'll be like, hey, there's two guys who had too much beer and they're slugging it out in the street. That's a mutual affray. But if we went and get in a fight, that's probably going to be, unless one of us hits the other one with a brick or a knife or something like that, it's probably just going to be simple assault on each other, et cetera. But when a victim is a vulnerable person like a child or a woman who's much weaker physically than her partner, something like that, and it can work. DV can work the other way. We've decided ethically that DV is worse than regular V. And so we've made that ethical choice, and we've made legal enhancements based on that ethical choice. So if you look at the law across the board, that's what we're doing all over the place. There's no universal principle that says that a contract should be honored, right? It's not. There's not. We know what a contract is. It's an agreement, a meeting of the minds. Two people believe they're going to carry on a transaction, sale of goods, sale of services, something like that, along with consideration. I'll do this service or I'll give you this good. In return, you'll give me money, right? That's a contract. There's nothing inherently moral about that. We've chosen to decide that that is something that we're going to honor and protect. So you see the ethical choice reflected in the civil law of contracts. We make moral choices about excuse from performing contracts. Act of God. If there's a volcano eruption and it keeps you from, it's theoretically the law could say, we don't care about volcano eruptions. You made an agreement, you're going to enforce it. But we've made an ethical choice to excuse that because it causes hardship, and loss, and can drive people out of business because a volcano went off and interfered with your performance.
Yeah. So Rob,
these are real examples, right? Like volcanoes literally interfere with performance of business obligations sometimes. Yeah, so do floods. Right. So do hurricanes.
Yeah. So Rob, those are great. Yeah. So those are great examples. So what I heard you say, to synthesize for our listeners, the foundation is ethics.
Yep.
Society's convictions about right and wrong. You had a wonderful phrase that statutes or laws are the codification, the written codification of those. And then at the prosecutorial level in the criminal justice system, there's discretion that prosecutors can apply to what cases they bring, what judgments they seek, et cetera.
Yep, exactly.
So that's a great foundation. We're going to explore a couple of cases that are related to both your vocation and your passion before we segue to AI. In this first episode, we're going to explore a couple of cases. And the first one is the Fat Leonhard case. And for those, probably all of our listeners, because they tend to be involved in national security, have heard a bit about it. But just take us just a minute, and give a synopsis of who is Fat Leonhard, what was the issue, and then we'll unpack it in more detail.
Yeah. So Fat Leonhard is a funny name. It's classic military, right? We can't remember a guy's name, so we come up with some kind of characteristic for him. So Fat Leonhard was a defense contractor, Malaysian, I believe. His name was Leonard Glenn Francis, and he ran a marine services company that serviced out of the Far East. I think it was based in either Malaysia or Hong Kong, but he did pierside services.
I thought it was Singapore, but it doesn't matter.
It might have been Singapore, yeah. Yeah, that's right. So he would provide stevedoring services for ships that were coming in to port all over the Far East. I don't know if he was doing it in Australia, but certainly, Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, anywhere that Seventh Fleet. And Seventh Fleet is the Navy fleet. It is a 3-star level headquarters underneath U.S. Pacific Fleet, which is a 4-star level headquarters, which is under INDOPACOM, which is the combatant command that controls U.S. military operations, basically in the Far East. There's a line in the Pacific from that demarcates NORTHCOM from INDOPACOM and Third Fleet from Seventh Fleet. But Hawaii, all the way over into the Indian Ocean. It's a big expanse of territory, and ships are going all over. Yeah, I mean, they're busy. One of the big issues has been op-tempo. We've seen some collisions that have happened out there, and one of the root causes we've seen is this insane op-tempo that we put on the ships. We got a Navy that's smaller than ever. The appetite for naval engagement is bigger, maybe not bigger than ever, but it's big and increasing. And the distances out there are just insane. So really couldn't. I've seen it argued that one of the reasons for Fat Leonhard with the corruption that I'm about to explain is this is stuff that the government should be doing for itself. I don't know. I think that might be impossible. I mean, given the tyranny of distance and the availability of material, the things that Navy ships need when they come in, it is just not unusual to use these services, whether it's offloading sewage or onloading fresh food, or onloading fresh water, topping off fresh water. Fresh water from ashore is always better than water that's made on ship through the reverse osmosis process. It just tastes better and stuff like that. So you always want to top off with landside water whenever you can. Everybody leaves port with full water tanks. All the services that you would need. There's all kinds of things that a ship needs when it comes into a port. And he was right there. He seemed to be the guy that was on Johnny on the spot at every one of these places. And he was making really hundreds of millions of dollars for himself. It turns out he had this brilliant business acumen. for being at the right place at the right time with the right stuff, because he was getting fed secret information about ship schedules from certain people in the. So there was two things: he had an information advantage about where ships were going to be, so he could be ready. Right? If a competitor
that's
has
fine under the Federal Acquisition Regulation. I mean, that's not an issue.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah. So the information advantage, it's if a competitor has 2 days notice that a ship is coming in and needs these things, and probably will need these things, and Fat Leonhard's company had 30 days notice that a ship was coming in, or 2 weeks notice, he's obviously in a much better position to provide those things. And when you establish a track record of always being there and always being ready with the things that the ships need, he enjoyed a pretty good reputation for operational support. He did so because people were slipping him information in return for favors, monetary favors, and other, shall we call, performance favors. There was good evidence of the fact that people were getting...
delicate way to put that. Thank you.
Getting wined and dined and comped hotel rooms in the nicest places. I went to the Philippines last year on a work trip to do some cyber consulting for the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. We stayed in the Shangri-La in Manila. Oh my God, it was the nicest hotel I've ever stayed in my life. And as I'm walking around this place, it's in the business district of Manila, and everybody who's anybody stays at the Shangri-La or a couple of the hotels around it. It's just opulent. I mean, it's just an incredible resort. And I'm walking around, and all I'm thinking of is Fat Leonhard. Not because he stayed in Manila, but that kind of opulence, you could see how it could be super attractive. I was super happy to stay there. They treated me like a king. I had a lovely room. The food was excellent. All I had, it set me up to be able to go and do the work that we were doing. So I can see how it's attractive, right? It's very, very attractive when you're in the Far East. These hotels are extraordinary. Some evidence of some prostitution services being provided by him. So he was basically, these guys were living fat, dumb, and happy out there, and all they had to do was slip him some ship schedule information. And that on its face is unethical, but uncontrolled access to ship schedule information that can get out there and fall into the hands of China or North Korea could have been disastrous. People's lives could have been at stake because adversaries knew where ships were going to be. So he had that advantage. And the other thing is, once you establish that track record, he became a preferred source. So the admirals and the captains, they just wouldn't hear of going with anybody else because Fat Leonhard was pressing the easy button. And there's some good evidence out there that he was throwing some really lavish parties. It's just not too hard to see how a culture of Fat Leonhard only overcame the entire Seventh Fleet when it came to stevedoring services. Is a mess. So, shall I stop there, Frank, to set the stage with Fat Leonhard, or shall we keep rolling?
No. So I think that gives everybody who's not familiar with it a thumbnail. So he is not only behaving with a set of U.S. Navy officers, they're not only behaving unethically, they're behaving illegally. Chris made reference to the Federal Acquisition Regulation. You can't give contractors favored positions based on them slipping you cash and providing you prostitutes. And again, back to our original discussion, those that have no concept of what the FAR says, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, those that have no concept of U.S. code, know that ethically that's a blatant violation. So how was it discovered, Rob? Kind of what was... For those that have seen, you didn't NCIS
even mention
on TV.
The Corruption Act, Frank. I mean, but blatant violation. Blatant.
Yeah.
Not close to the edge of the field.
We're
running off outside the side.
Chris, I think you're talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I do not recall that anybody was prosecuted under the FCPA probably because of proof problems. It was just so much easier to prove up the quid pro quo ethical violations or honest services fraud or things like that than it was to try to prove up FCPA violations. But the FCPA is out there, and it has teeth. And the government takes it seriously. And I didn't come here to plug a book, and it's not even my book to plug, but Craig Whitlock is a journalist, a New York Times journalist. He's just written.
No relation.
No, yeah, that's right. No relation. That's right. We should make that disclaimer. Speaking of ethics, no relation to Chris. He's written a wonderful book, and I'm about 2/3 through it now. I wish I had finished it before this thing, but I kind of know where he's going. I know the story, so I know where he's going. But a wonderful, he's an excellent writer. He's a joy to read. But B, he's done an extraordinary job of pulling everything together and laying it down. I mean, that's what investigative reporters do, right? They just get in there and grind through the sources, and he's put everything together in a really compelling narrative. I don't remember what the name of the book is, but if anybody's interested, just go on Amazon and Google Craig Whitlock, Fat Leonhard, and it'll pop up. I think the word Fat Leonhard is in the title.
Cool. So,
but
Rob,
anyways,
what is, for those that have seen the TV show NCIS or aware of it, what is the NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and what role, if any, did it play? Kind of how was this discovered, and how did the prosecution unfold?
Fantastic. Some of it, it began to unravel through some whistleblowing. These things they aren't kept secret. You know, people know what's going on. Everybody kind of knows under the underground. Oh, here comes Fat Leonhard again. So there's the murmuring at the deck plates, and there became some whistleblowing. And once they started pulling the thread, the whole blanket fell apart, right? Interestingly, one of the major vulnerabilities in this case was that Fat Leonhard had compromised an NCIS agent who was keeping him apprised of the status of the investigation almost at every step. I mean, talk about a breach of duty. There's the Navy people who have one duty, but this is a criminal investigative officer whose job it is to police this stuff, and he had him compromised as well. For my money, it's not as bad as a guy like Robert Hansen, but they're on the same scale. Right? I mean, nobody died as a result of this, as opposed to Hansen, where people actually died because of the information he provided. But it's a real stat,
you just
right?
liken this to one of the biggest CI counter intel cases in our history.
What I'm saying is, there's a scale. There's a what is the word I'm looking for? A continuum. And Hansen's way out to the right on the continuum. I don't know if he's at the end of the continuum. Is it possible that somebody did something worse than Robert Hansen? I guess, but what Hansen was doing was really bad. I'm not saying this guy, he's on the Hansen scale. He's on the lower end of the Hansen scale, but being on the Hansen scale at all is terrible, right? I mean, talk about a breach of his professional duty and his ethical and his moral duty. But to NCIS's credit, they did investigate, even though they were compromised from the inside. It took them a while to figure that out. They investigated it. I've had mixed results as a military prosecutor and as a staff judge advocate over time with NCIS. I've had some agents that I loved like brothers. One of my best friends in the world is an NCIS agent that I deployed to Iraq with, and I love that guy, and he was super competent. But he was an outlier. The average agent, I've had mixed results with him over time, but they did a pretty good job on this investigation. You got to give credit where credit's due. Even though they were leaking water from the inside, they did a pretty good job with this investigation. And NCIS, I'm sure they were aided by DCIS, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. And they're one of their biggest mandates is public corruption inside of DOD. So DCIS had a hand in this as well. But I mean, there you go. You know, if you can compromise the law enforcement agency and get updates on how the investigation is going, man, you've really got it whooped.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So Rob, what's the net, who was prosecuted in summary, and kind of what is the state of the punishments today? And then in a moment, we'll talk a little bit about those who are kind of pushing back and saying this is much to do about nothing.
Yeah, good. So all the cases, the federal criminal cases, there were no courts martial out of this. And the reason for that, I believe, I'm almost positive, there's an MOU between the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice that gives the Department of Justice right of first refusal for public corruption cases that happen inside of DOD. There is no way DOJ was going to trust these cases to the military criminal case, military criminal system. They were picking off, but at the same time, we're talking about hundreds of officers that were being investigated. Hundreds.
Wow.
Hundreds. they wound up with, I don't know the number, about a dozen, maybe 15, maybe 20, something like that. Not out of hundreds that they selected for prosecution. And that also, we're talking about ethics, that reflects an ethical choice too. It also reflects a practical choice. That was just, hundreds would have been too big for one U.S. Attorney's Office to do it. The Southern District of California in San Diego was prosecuting these things. So they pick out the worst cases, the ones where they can show, where they believe they can really show senior officers making really, really bad choices in order to set examples, right? So they weren't really going after lieutenant command. They weren't going after 04s. They were going after 06s and above, including some pretty senior commanders, 06 commanders, people that you want to believe in them and some of the conduct that was occurring. Man, I could talk about this all day. Sometimes you get these cultures of malaise and cultures of privilege that kind of leak in, where people lose the ability to see moral choices for what they are. And the counter to that, in my view, is, yeah, so what? You're an officer. We talk about this stuff all the time for the purposes of reminding you that it's your obligation to remain objective in policing your own conduct and the conduct of people around you. I think sometimes those cultures just get a little bit lazy and relaxed, and you get a little bit of a sense of, well, this is how it's always been and everybody's doing it. An officer should be able to look at that and say, yeah, well, I'm not doing that because I accept that might be the norm out here, but I'm not doing it. Would that throw a wrinkle into things if some 06 ship commander decided, I mean, it could have, now he's got admirals looking down at him going, what are you doing? We've got a thing working here, and they're always Johnny on the spot. You're going to slow down operations if we don't use Fat Leonhard because he's the guy with the water and the sewage services and who's overbilling. There's lots of evidence. The way he was making extra money was A, he was getting business without having to compete for it, and competition being the norm. And B, he was juicing invoices left and right. So, for example, if they needed to pump out, 20,000 gallons of sewage or something like that, he was billing 50,000 gallons of sewage. If I recall correctly, and I don't want to get called out on this, but I'm almost certain there were some invoices where he was certifying that he pumped out more sewage than the ship could hold. So in other words, like, let's say that the ship was holding 10,000 gallons of sewage or something like that, and he's billing for 30,000. That's impossible. It's factually impossible. And those invoices were never being checked. They were just checked and paid and so forth. There are some weaknesses in the way that we pay invoices. The people who certify invoices sometimes for services are pretty junior, and they're not really responsible. They see an invoice come in, it's for a service. They certify that the service is gone and it's gone. And there's never actually any really fact checking. All it would have taken was let's say that in the sewage example, all it would have taken for one person to go, hey, that's a lot of sewage. I don't think that type ship can hold that much sewage. But instead it's just a conveyor belt, and it's just government money. Don't worry about it. Sign it off and let it go. There's so many cultural problems, little procedural problems that manifest themselves. You kind of know how they are, but they're front and center with blinking red lights as a result.
Yeah, Rob, to me, we can come back to this, Frank, but what you just articulated is a heart or a central issue in the rub around AI. That issue you just talked about, a junior person's ability to understand, hey, there's X amount of gallons of capacity here. Why am I getting charged double? That's a very simple thing to understand. A lot of AI, the technical nature of what is going on to lay people seems like magic. And I believe there is a tendency to just keep that at arm's length or trust. Hey, really smart people are working on this. I mean, it's massively apparent in survey after survey, and it's apparent in interactions. Executives even don't understand well the constraints on how some of these capabilities work, things that are dragging along for the ride as far as performance issues or risks. And I could see it being very easy for people in the legal community to just keep that at arm's length and just the conveyor belt kind of process you just talked about, not give adequate scrutiny as we're engaged in engineering and designing new capability.
I love that connection you made, and I can't wait till we can come back to that, maybe in the second episode, most likely. But, we had this expression in the Marine Corps. Maybe you've heard this, and it might have transferred into the Army. PFM. Do you know what PFM is? The P is pure, and the M is magic.
Oh, yeah. I'm tracking 100%. Okay.
F magic, and the others, and this wasn't a Marine Corps, but the black box, it's in the black box. Don't worry about it. It's in the magic black box. And it is a problem when senior leaders black box things, right? That when they don't dig down, people talking to very senior levels who have a hard time resetting their own passwords. And I really think that they're not drilling down. Probably this is not a new problem, but with AI, the problem, it goes like this, right? This trusting tech to do the thing that it's supposed to do has been a problem for a long time. But now I think, and we're going to talk about this in the second episode, I think, but I have this idea about the tech curve going like this, but that the curve for understanding is still more, the slope is lower, but the tech curve is a parabola. And so that delta between is a real problem.
Yeah. So, Frank, you should come back to this, Frank, in the later one. But I will just tell you one brief thing, Rob. Frank recently, last several months, has been probing a set of business issues. He asked a lawyer a question. Lawyer came back with, I don't know about that much about this, but I asked ChatGPT, and this is the answer it gave me. To me, in the work that Frank and I do, rank insanity. I literally cannot believe a professional did that. And if you're listening, dear person, love you. That was stupid. It was really dumb. But that's how people are.
Let me give you my card. You will never get that answer out of me.
Yeah. So, Rob, that was helpful. I wouldn't have thought about that MOA between DOJ and DOD, and can totally understand having a daughter who's a prosecutor, that the DOJ was not turning those cases over to DOD, and just intuitively I can understand it. There's a
trust gap too. I mean, the military has. I mean, you just go back and look at the headlines, and it's not entirely fair because civilian prosecutors goof up cases all the time too. So it's not pretend like there's this massive competence gap. But when the military goofs up cases, it makes front page headlines, right? I mean, you take some of the war crimes cases that came out, and they're front page news all the time, and it's failure after failure after failure after failure in the military justice system. It's not unreasonable that DOJ would look over and go, we don't exactly know what's happening over there, but we're going to take the face shot if these cases fall apart. So we're going to take control.
If this content is of use to you, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this episode a like. If you're listening to this episode on Apple or Spotify, please take time to give us a 5-star rating. And if you have a moment, leave us a quick review. You'll find more resources like this podcast and training courses at our site, aileaders.com. Let us know what you think. We value your feedback.
Well, and they are a law enforcement department. The Department of Defense has much broader responsibilities than law enforcement. So it makes perfect sense now that you said it. No court martials, therefore. Did anyone go to jail? What were the effects of the criminal prosecutions?
Yeah, there were some prosecutions and some confinements of some senior Navy folks. And this is the part where I tell you about 5 cases that just fell apart in May because the prosecutors recognized that there had been some significant Brady violations. Brady is a Supreme Court case. I'm using Brady as shorthand. There's a bunch of cases that speak to this, and also the U.S. Attorney's Manual. And the U.S. Attorney's Manual, the U.S. Attorney's Manual is the manual that tells federal prosecutors how to do their jobs. In many, many places, it's more restrictive than the law requires for policy reasons. The best example I can give of that, and this is ethics making its way into policy governing law, is that the DOJ's policy on prosecuting journalists, for example, is more restrictive than the law requires. DOJ's policy on demanding sources from journalists, for example, is more restrictive than the law requires. That is a policy judgment that the government, no matter which party is in charge, the government has decided as a matter of ethics that journalists doing their function is more important than the evidence that we might be able to extract from them in any particular case. That's the general rule. Now, there's exceptions to that. Sometimes they'll say, nope, we want an exception to this, and the authority to grant exceptions is withheld at really high levels. I think at the Deputy Attorney General level, if I recall correctly. So it's withheld at such a high level that if you're going to depart from that norm, that ethical norm, you have to make your case to the Deputy Attorney General, and he bears the political consequence of making that decision. So in ways, it's a very elegant system in that it recognizes the tension between what the law will let you do and what you think you should do in the exercise route. So anyway, that's so these 5 cases, Brady and the U.S. Attorney's Manual, they realize Brady requires the government to identify and turn over any exculpatory material that tends to make it less likely that a defendant will be convicted of something. Anything that helps to mitigate his criminal liability. The government can't just hold on to it. They have an affirmative obligation to disclose that to the other side. It is the prosecutor's determination to make on his own what's covered by Brady. But if in a close case, if a prosecutor thinks that he can withhold something, he has avenues. It's not just a L hanging on him. There's more senior attorneys up the chain that he can go to and get opinions. He could seek an in-camera review, a one-on-one review with the judge that says, Judge, here, I'm disclosing it to you. Must I turn this over? They did not do that. They withheld some evidence that might have affected the guilt of these 5 defendants. I looked at the evidence. I don't think it was very important for them to withhold at all. I don't think it would have likely changed the outcome of the case. So these prosecutors took this kind of crazy risk with withholding this information, and ultimately it gutted their cases. To DOJ's credit, DOJ found this failure to disclose, and the DOJ went in and said, hey, Judge, we have a problem with these cases. We did not meet our own obligations under the law. Imagine that, right? The ethics of identifying that you made a mistake and going in and saying, justice requires us to tell you about this now.
So this wasn't a defense. This wasn't a defense appeal. These 5 cases fell apart because justice
DOJ
essentially was upholding its own
that
ethics.
is really terrible.
Yeah,
it is, but it's also wonderful. It's wonderful in a weird way in that DOJ is policing. It shows that DOJ will police itself sometimes. I'm not cheerleading for DOJ. I know they make some mistakes, and reasonable minds can differ about. But in this case, on that instance, they did the right thing with these cases because the following disclosure rules and discovery rules under Brady is more important to the perception of DOJ's integrity than these 5 cases. It's just terrible because it was a stupid choice by the prosecutor, probably. Had he disclosed that information at the right time, it probably wouldn't. Hindsight's 20/20, but it probably wouldn't have affected those cases at all. But now they've fallen apart because of that.
So, Rob, 5 cases fell apart.
Yeah.
Again, kind of at the senior most levels, what was the outcome, or what were the outcomes of the prosecutions for the most senior people?
Yeah, most of the prosecutions were at the 06 and 1-star level. I do not recall that any 2 stars or higher were prosecuted. Some careers were ended. Some 2-star and 3-star careers were ended. A lot of careers were ended over this thing. Even though they weren't prosecuted, the evidence was sufficient for the Navy to say, yeah, you didn't do the right thing here. We are certainly not going to advance you anymore. So officers who were rumored to be on meteoric tracks for rising suddenly were just cut off at the knees. I think the Navy Supply Corps has been hollowed out a little bit. They lost a lot of people who were forced to retire, or it kind of ended their progression of their careers. It's not good. It really took an impact on the Navy Supply Corps. The Navy Supply Corps are the officers who were responsible for the logistics. They were closest to the problem here, the corruption problem with the providing of the logistics by Glenn Defense, but it's the commanders who were ultimately responsible. So you had, this 2-tier thing. You had the logistics people who were in the weeds and were seeing at a granular level this corruption, but it was the commanders who were also nudging and influencing business to Glenn Defense, Fat Leonhard's company. And a lot of careers ended of it. So a handful of people got prosecuted and went to jail. some 3-stars. Twig Branch was the director of Navy intelligence. He got his security clearance stripped, and he sat as a director of Navy intelligence for almost 2 years, awaiting the Navy deciding what to do with him without a security clearance, which is the wildest and dumbest thing I've ever heard. And there was a lot of careers. There was another 2-star. I'm not going to name him, but he was, everybody knew this guy was on his way. Now, there's a particular characteristic about him, and I won't name it because then I'll be naming him. But he came to NATO and worked while he was waiting. He had a big job in Navy surface fleet, and then he should have advanced on from there, probably to get a 3rd star, and maybe beyond. Nobody, it's just hard to tell. But he had a track record that would have made him super competitive for promotion, at least a 3-star, maybe above. And he got caught up in this thing because he was at SurfPac, or he was in an assignment where he really was kind of at the center of this thing. So they sent him to NATO, where I was working, and he did a job there for about a year while the investigation petered out. And then all of a sudden I looked up one day and he had disappeared. So they disappeared a lot of people over this stuff. They ended a lot of careers that were on the rise because they touched this thing. It became a kind of a 3rd rail.
Wow.
Fat Leonhard himself was also prosecuted. And interestingly, while he was awaiting sentencing, he was at home on house arrest with a ankle monitor. One day he decides to cut the ankle monitor off. He's prearranged some sort, when you're sitting on 8 figures, you can, that buys a lot of favors. He was able to get across the border into Mexico, and then he pops up in Venezuela. And so the Venezuelans had him down there, and he's living his fat life down in Venezuela. I guess he had access to cash, probably parked some money in some offshore account in the Caymans or somewhere like that he would have access to money. And he was living down there. Eventually, the United States, when we figured out that he was down there, we got the Venezuelans to arrest him. But it's not like we've got like a really great relationship with the Venezuelans, right? If he popped up in Colombia, we would have just asked, hey, get him, bring him back. And the Colombians, because of the closeness of our relationship, would probably just send him back. The same with Mexico. There's a lot of that stuff going on with the cartels and so forth. We would just ask for him to send them over. But the Venezuelans, they're gonna leverage that. So we got him back in a prisoner swap. We released some folks back to Venezuela in return for Fat Leonhard coming back to us. So he's in custody here in the States now. If I recall correctly, he's still awaiting sentencing. Don't quote me on that. He may have been sentenced, but I think that he's still awaiting sentencing. So he'll get his. He'll go in jail. Oh, he's called Fat Leonhard because apparently he's like, I've never seen him in person, but I know folks who dealt with him routinely. He was 6'2", 350 pounds or something like that.
Wow.
Like wheezed when he walked, but he was that big, fat, jolly guy. He's like a movie character out of a mob movie. You know what I mean? Except this mob wasn't a Cosa Nostra. It was stevedore corruption in the Pacific.
Yeah.
The movie is going to be great someday.
Yeah.
I hope Craig sells his book into a screenplay because the movie is going to be terrific.
In a sad way. So, Rob,
in a sad way.
Yeah, let's just take a few minutes then. There's a more recent case, which really is disturbing in terms of institutional failure of ethics. Take just a minute, and what is this more recent case? And it also happens to be in the Navy.
No, it doesn't happen to be in the Navy. That turn of phrase suggests that this is a coincidence, Frank. It is not a coincidence. That's exactly the point. I'm not picking on you for using that phrase. What I'm saying is it is unsurprising that it's in the Navy. I'm not bashing the Navy, but they got a problem, and this case shows that they still haven't fixed it. Right? This is the vice CNO. So the CNO, for listeners that are out there, is the Chief of Naval Operations. His counterpart in the Marine Corps is the Commandant of the Marine Corps. His counterpart, the CNO's counterpart in the Army and Air Force is the Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. They're the service lead. And the Vice CNO is also a 4-star who's the number 2. And they have different response. The CNO is in charge of the Navy. He's in command of the Navy. all of its purposes, training, shipbuilding, all the things that are necessary for him to be able to supply naval forces to the combatant commanders for employment. The vice CNO has a portfolio that is under the CNO's direction, but he's kind of the expert in things like requirements. So he's a member of the JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, for example. He advises for the CNO in the tank when the CNO is not available, things like that. So he has his own portfolio. He's the number 2. Sometimes the vice CNO goes on to be number 1. Sometimes they go from being the number 2 in a service out to a combatant command. This guy has been indicted for corruption because he negotiated while he was on active duty for post-government employment with a company for which he was responsible for steering certain education and training contracts. And what the fun is, these weren't even huge contracts. We're not talking about, $100 million contract or a $50 million contract. Relatively, these were small potatoes. But he was pushing this vendor as a particular source for this education and training contracts, and at the same time talking to them on the side about employment with that company out after he left the Navy. This is a cardinal sin. Everybody knows this. You get this in your ethics briefs every year. I can't tell you how many times I've briefed this to senior officers, particularly ones that are retiring. Every time that a senior officer is retiring, any officer, I would write an opinion letter that says, here are the legal standards. Who are you negotiating for employment with? Okay, you're going to go to BAE Systems. Have you had any particular matters underneath your responsibility? Did they add up to what dollar figure? Most of the time, the guys come in and they go, no, I wasn't a procurement officer. I didn't have spending responsibility. Most of the time, they're okay. In this case, the vice CNO could not possibly have answered that question truthfully. So he's being prosecuted for what amounts actually to rank corruption for steering contracts to a company with whom he was negotiating for employment. It is a smaller, but in some ways more disgusting version of the Air Force's deal, the Secretary of the Air Force, Darlene Drunion, and Boeing a few years ago. These cases are out there. Darlene Drunion, everybody knows about that case, and yet people still wander into this minefield. Right on the heels of Fat Leonhard drug the Navy down in 7th Fleet. I mean, its reputation is, I don't know how you maintain moral leadership of sailors when your senior officers are doing these things. And talking about integrity, I'm sure they're talking about integrity at boot camp. They're talking about integrity at OCS and at the Naval Academy and all these places. And at the same time, you've got senior officers out there. They are not consistent messages. And on the heels of the Fat Leonhard conspiracy, absolutely hollowing out the 7th Fleet and the Supply Corps, you've got a 4-star. It's not like he wasn't on notice. He was the vice CNO. He knew all about this stuff. He had access to all of this information. There's no secrets. And yet there he is. How do you explain it? Is it a culture issue? Well, clearly, right? It has to be, right? And I don't think it's a cowboy culture issue. I don't think people are being reckless. I think they get lazy and comfortable. And they don't really recognize things for what they are, because it's hard to be objective about yourself. And I'm not giving him an out because he's probably going to go to jail. The vice CNO is probably going to go to jail. He's almost certainly going to go, and he was retired when they arrested him. The Navy is almost certainly going to initiate a retirement grade review. So I suspect if they only uncover this misconduct from when he was a 4-star, the law allows him to retire him as a 3-star, but no lower, because the state legal standard is you're retired in the last grade satisfactorily served. So by definition, he served satisfactorily as a 3-star if they advanced him to 4-star, right? And so if they don't uncover any of this stuff from when he was a 3-star, they'll probably retire him as a 3-star. And that's fine because he earned, he did serve. It's like a 401k, right? You don't just take somebody's property because they did something bad unless it's connected to a crime. So they will almost certainly retire him. I would anticipate he'll retire as a 3-star. That, aside from the felony conviction that's probably coming his way, that downgrade in retirement will cost him some hundreds of thousands of dollars over the life of the retirement. And even more if they find evidence that allows them to retire him as a 2-star or 1-star.
I would argue the financial part is minor compared to what
it is minor. But it's it will amount to several $100,000 fine on top of everything. It's not really a fine; it's a foregoing of the entitlement. But it is it will cost him money. That's not insignificant, right?
I think,
But you're
Rob,
right. It's
there's
minor.
a facet of this to my natural reaction, and you and I are in a group where we interact on these things regularly. But my natural instinct was to orient to him. But I also have a pretty high degree of animus towards industry. It ticks me off that people in industry approach government in this way. It's not necessary. We have ways to compete that are ethical and legal, and to me, there's not an excuse of, well, I didn't know. You just can't do this. And in like what world could those two leaders that approached him in that way think that was right?
Yeah.
What did they talk about before they sat down over dinner with him to, here's how we're going to uncloak this. It's just industry has an obligation as well to behave in a legal and ethical way.
Couldn't agree with you more. And so our error rates, so we know some of our error rates are from the cases we find. And we have to assume there's also a contribution to the error rate of the cases we don't find. But still, there's probably pretty good evidence that most companies do it right most of the time. And I'm not simping for industry or anything like that, but it's true. And they do so maybe primarily because they have internal ethical codes, but there's also a stick here with the carrot, right? The carrot is that the company wants to be perceived as an ethical actor, and corporate social responsibility is a thing. Investors now more than ever demand that of companies. They will not accept that kind of stuff. You can ruin a company by just losing the faith of your investors. You have a moral responsibility to your investors. Socially conscious investing is a high, and it's creeping. Go ask some venture capitalists. Socially conscious investing is creeping its way into, you're going to see that in the innovative defense tech market as investors become increasingly concerned about how the products are being used in places like Gaza. There are people out there who I imagine have divested from companies because they realize that some of those weapons are causing what some people would call a genocide in Gaza. Didn't note, I'm making no opinions on that. But there is an ICJ case where a couple of states have accused Israel of genocide. And so far, it's an open question. And the ICJ has, in fact, required Israel to take provisional measures, which is a legal recognition that that it is possible that they will find genocide down the road. So, and so socially conscious investing is a thing. Companies have to contend with that. They can like it or not like it, but without being able to sell their stocks, right? It'll affect share price and all that stuff. This is a thing they have to deal with. But there's also this, there's bid protests that cost them money and all those things. But getting debarred is the worst thing ever, right? And so this company, the company that's involved in the VCNO, I don't even know if it's a going concern or not, but if it's not, there's no way they're not going to get debarred. This is the end of the road for that company. They're going to be out of business over this.
Just real quick, Rob, for those that don't know, what is debarment?
Debarment is when DOD tells a business that they may not, tells a company that they may not, it's not just DOD, any agency can do it. Tells companies that you may not do business with us anymore. And so if you're a defense company that is organized around 90% of your business is about selling to the defense market and you get debarred, you're done. If you're not diversified and so forth. But debarment's bad. Even if you take 10% of a company's business, you could be putting them out of business. So debarment is the ultimate thing. Sometimes it's temporary. It could be suspension for a certain period of time. But if you're permanently debarred, and you're in the defense industry, you are out of luck. So that is the ultimate stick. And that is the thing that probably drives, corporate codes of conduct more than anything else. Because the risks are just, they're catastrophic, right? That's a smart bomb on Defender, right? Whoop, you're done. So that makes
Frank and I, Rob, we worked together in several very large firms, big brand name firms, and we had our own business. But in each of the large firms, to your point, this was regularly trained. There's no mystery around the boundary of behavior. Like it was painful every year. You're going through an annual recertification. Hey, this is what's allowable. This is what is not allowable. Let me give you this scenario. Does this look right? Does that? there was no mystery around that. And that's part of what really aggravates me with industry in this instance.
Yeah.
Responsible companies also have aggressive ethics and compliance departments. They have people who are trained investigators who go out and investigate problems. They take remedial action on their own. So if there ever is a DOJ investigation or a DOJ enforcement action, they can hold up their compliance program and go, look, we're following your guidelines. We're doing everything right. This is an outlier, and we acted promptly. And generally, DOJ will look at it and go, yes, that is what we want industry to do. Good job. Good job. So, it is a problem. I do think industry is probably better than ever. And these ethics and compliance and the investigators, that's all cost center, right? I mean, they are spending their own money to do this stuff. In a way, it's also a profit center, because if you can avoid being put out of business, isn't avoidance of loss the same thing as profit? But I digress. You know, they get a bad reputation because. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, Rob, this was a great discussion. We wanted to do a couple of things that you've done just excellently with these cases. We wanted to have our listeners, before we dive in the next episode to talking about ethics, the law, and AI, we wanted to establish this importance of the foundational level of ethics, which you have done excellently. And we have tied that to not only what senior leaders do, but when you talked about some of those people that are passing invoices through the supply corps, those were very junior troops, either civilian or military, that were doing that. And Chris made the point, in an AI context, those could well be lower level data scientists. And then thirdly, we've established that this is a government industry partnership in the discussion we just had to maintain the ethical standards. And that's going to be even more true in AI, because most of the solutions are going to be developed by industry. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And to have
can I make a connection here, Frank, really quick? And then that is the AI. So this passing the invoices thing that I was talking about, where they just don't quite get enough scrutiny. And there are supervisors who are scrutinizing, but they can't scrutinize them all, right? So they're scrutinizing maybe, I don't know, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, and they're looking at them because they're spot checking and stuff like that. AI can spot check 20 out of 20, right? This is a place where we can leverage technology to improve ethical compliance. That should be a growth industry for business to say, we're going to help you stay compliant. We're going to use AI to do it, because AI never sleeps. It can think on this stuff all the time. You don't have to worry about doing spot checks. Your spot check rate will be 100%. Now, will it flag tons and tons of stuff for human review? Probably. Then do a better job of avoiding the flags by doing it right the first time, right? Like AI can drive compliance. And that is a super exciting growth industry, I think.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we want to have you back for a second episode where we're going to probe specifically AI and its relationship to evolving statute, because the statutes, as you're going to explain, are evolving, and then the connection to that ethical foundation. But for now,
I can't wait. I didn't blow it today. I'm getting invited back.
You're getting invited back. You're getting invited back. It's both the substance of your remarks and the quality of your haircut that's going
It's funny to look at on the screen, though, man. It's like, hello, hello, hello.
Yes. So thank you very much. For our listeners out there, that wraps us up for this episode. If you'd like more information and more resources on how to equip leaders to lead AI programs, projects, people, and technology, just check out our website, aileaders.com. But on behalf of Chris, Rob, and I, we'll see you back for the second episode. Appreciate you.
Can't wait. Thanks, guys.